Just music in the background. When man first walked on the moon in 1969, it was the culmination of many missions undertaken by NASA, with most of them being successful. But what pushed us to space travel? How did it begin? And what was our ultimate goal? The main thing that pushed us was Russia, when in October of 1957 they launched the first artificial Earth-orbiting satellite called Sputnik. So let's go back. It's 1958. We're over a decade removed from World War II. Elvis Presley is on the radio, and the Milwaukee Braves and the New York Yankees play in the World Series. It was in July of that year that NASA was established by President Dwight Eisenhower. In a 2005 Journal of Air Transportation article, Fred Hansen and Donald Pitts state that NASA would assume responsibility for all space activities, and the President stressed that the explorations would be conducted solely for peaceful purposes. The Department of Defense and the Air Force were initially involved in funding, researching, and development. The initial goal was to reach suborbital levels. Spacecraft reach of space was not complete in an entire orbital revolution. According to Hansen and Pitts, the Air Force was reviewing how to quickly modify an intercontinental ballistic missile launch vehicle to propel a ballistic capsule system, referred to as the man in the can, to low Earth orbit. Project Mercury was initiated in October 1958 with three goals: orbit a manned spacecraft around the Earth, investigate man's ability to function in space, and recover man and spacecraft safely. But in the early days of Mercury, there were many budget overruns. In a 1963 Bulletin of Atomic Scientists article titled Lessons of Project Mercury, author Richard Lewis says one reason for the budget overruns was that there were no pieces of the capsule that were off the shelf of any other program that ever existed. Everything had to be created from scratch. As well as that, they hadn't developed the techniques or the work habits for the space age. The first 7 astronauts recruited were Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Donald Deke Slayton. They were dubbed the Mercury 7. But the Russia beat the US again when Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth in a Vostok capsule in April 1961. The very next month, Alan Shepard became the first American in space when his suborbital flight lasted just over 15 minutes. Also in May 1961, President John F. Kennedy made the goal to get Americans to the moon by the end of the decade. In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth in a 5-hour flight. Just over a year later, in May 1963, Gordon Cooper manned the last Mercury mission, an orbital flight that lasted over 34 hours. During the life of Project Mercury, NASA's estimated costs were $400 million, nearly $3 billion in today's money. As Richard Lewis stated in his Lessons of Project Mercury article, the U.S. learned that a trained pilot can function in an orbiting spacecraft in null gravity for at least 34 hours without lasting physical or mental effects. Project Gemini was the next one, designated in January 1962 as an intermediate step between Mercury and the Apollo program, which ultimately led us to the moon. In the article To the Moon, published in a 1963 issue of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Gemini was developed for 2-man Earth orbital missions lasting as long as 2 weeks. The first unmanned flight occurred in April 1964, with the first manned flight occurring in March 1965. The final orbital flight of Project Gemini occurred in November 1966 and lasted nearly 4 days. The Apollo project came next. Apollo 1 was the first manned flight of the program, but ended in tragedy in 1967. A cabin fire on the launch pad killed astronauts Gus Grissom, Edward Wright, and Roger Chaffee. These were the first fatalities in NASA since the inception. The capsule's highly pressurized 100% oxygen atmosphere, as well as many construction flaws, attributed to the tragedy. Nearly 2 years later, in December 1968, Apollo 8 became the first manned lunar orbital mission. 3 circumlunar missions followed, and Apollo 11 launched in 1969 in July of 1969 as the first mission to successfully land 2 astronauts on the moon. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were the astronauts on this mission, with Armstrong and Aldrin walking on the moon and Collins piloting the command module. It was reported that over 53 million households watched network coverage of the landing and the subsequent moonwalk. But following the jubilation of the U.S. beating Russia in the space race and to the moon, public support rapidly declined. Following a successful second lunar landing, Apollo 13 launched in April 1970. It inadvertently became a rescue mission when an oxygen tank exploded on board en route to the moon, therefore orbiting the lunar landing. Deemed a successful failure to the rescue of the crew, they still failed to make it to the moon. 4 successful lunar landings followed, with Apollo 17 being the final Apollo mission in December 1972. The budget began shrinking due to the arms race between the East and the West, and NASA switched its focus to the new shuttle program, with Apollo 18, 19, and 20 being canceled. Apollo was one of the most costly projects in American history in peacetime. In a 2011 History Today article titled Above and Beyond, Andre Below writes that official figures show that the original budget for Apollo was estimated to be $23 billion. It ended up being between $20 and $25 billion, thus being on budget, a remarkable feat considering its vastness, complexity, and novelty. In today's terms, that equates to approximately $140 billion. Over 40 years on, it's amazing what NASA achieved in that time period. Many things that many people thought would be impossible. In less than 10 years, they went from testing an unmanned suborbital launch to landing men on the moon, and the ultimate goal was met. Its extraordinary strides in science and technology enabled the missions, and we can attribute much of today's technologies to NASA and its achievements. Thank you.
Questions?
If you want.